Start getting comfortable with JavaScript rendering with Nik Ranger from StudioHawk. Brought to you by Majestic, I'm David Bain and this is SEO in 2022. Nik, what is your number one SEO tip for 2022?
Howdy. So I think everyone is very aware that we are in a pandemic, coming out of a pandemic in a lot of different countries all around the world. And with that, as all the traffic, the foot traffic is absorbing from the streets and now going online, everyone's looking at their websites and thinking like, what am I going to do to really make sure that we're hearing and being able to take that into consideration? Now, of course, for a lot of people, for a lot of site owners, web developers has been busier than ever creating new sites and being a technical SEO. A lot of my job has been around site migrations, and it's pretty much something that I've been just going through and talking about for the last at least 2 years. So when I wanted to think about 2022, I don't think that this is going to necessarily go away. I think that they're still going to be wanting to do this, and of course, what I'm seeing a massive influx is with developers wanting to develop sites using JavaScript libraries, which is completely fine. But there are some really, really important caveats that we as SEOs need to be able to communicate and understand to both of these parties in a project management sense.
So can JavaScript be better for SEO? Is it generally worse for SEO? Is it about the same? Does it just depend on how you use it?
It's a library that you can use like anything else. I think the aim or the mission is, okay, I want my site to be able to load super fast, because all I kind of hear, that gets filtered out through, from the most technical SEO to, the novice, is that site speed is really important, and it's considered that quote unquote ranking factor. So to oversimplify things, let's make a really, really fast site, and then everything else should kind of fall into place. I think that's the general gist when I'm talking to site owners, that's a general understanding. So they'll go to a web developer and they'll give a brief, which is, whatever you do, just make my site as fast as possible. And of course, in the web development world, JavaScript is really seen as the hero that is leveraged to be able to do that, because JavaScript will take parts of HTML, parts of CSS, and be able to combine that into, simpler forms of, JavaScript, which is far less lines, so therefore it's far less to be able to crawl and be able to perceive. That being said, when it comes to rendering, the process where Googlebot retrieves your pages, runs the code, assesses your content, understand that layout and structure on the site versus what is being able to be seen by different user agents, what that information collects from Google during the rendering process is then used to rank the quality of the page of the site against the content, and of course against all the other sites that are trying to rank for those specific keywords. So I think that is a part of the conversation in the planning process, in the brief, that is completely excluded. And of course, we have seen, or at least I have seen, a massive influx of sites that have been launched that are purely client-side rendered, and just, by default, all JavaScript is client-side rendered. I think it was Martin Split, who was if you use a JavaScript framework, the default is client-side rendered, means that you're using the bare bones HTML over, and then a piece of JavaScript, and then it basically fetches and samples the content back in the browser, just as a little bit of a base bit there. So I think when they're producing that, that's a part of the message that gets lost. So again, I think that's pretty important. And client-side rendering has two main downsides. First of all, it can increase the likelihood of actually a poor user experience, because JavaScript can add seconds of load time to a page, and again, kind of counterintuitive to what the whole thing is there, and be able to put a burden on the client, through the website visitor. The second big downside of client-side rendering is it affects on search engine bots. So, example, Googlebot, which is a user agent just like any other, has multiple waves of indexing. So, this is they have two waves. In the first wave, they crawl and they index the HTML of the page. And in the second wave, they come back and they render the JavaScript when those resources start to become available. So with that two-phase approach, it means sometimes JavaScript content can be missed. and not including Googlebot's index. And that's pretty much what I'm trying to, just communicate as something that I think is really, really important to be able to look for going into the new year.
So what are the common aspects that are often missed that can't be completely rendered and are probably not seen by search engines?
Well, it could be. I mean, it really depends on how much is being actually written in JavaScript, which isn't necessarily being rendered. So, say for example, like you're using maybe like native server-side rendering, like you're wanting to use like native server-side rendering in Shopify. Like if you're using, say, like a language like React on top of Shopify, it's kind of like having jQuery added to a website instead of having it on the server, which means you can't server-side render because everything's been client-side rendered. So essentially, you're not going to be able to communicate with the server at all, which is a really, really fancy way of saying it's just not interacting in the way that it can be able to produce all the resources needed that has been intended for that page. So if you go to your site and you're looking at some of the things, and a really, really quick way of being able to test this is like just literally copy out, a bit of the text on the page and do a right-hand click, go to view source, open up the DOM, which is like, the HTML that user agents will go through, crawl, and parse, and just try and find it. Just try and find like some of the text on there. A lot of the time, as we know, Google really does rely on the text and the HTML to be able to parse and understand what is the context of a page. So if it's not being able to see that, then it's not going to have any context for any of the other elements of the page. So from a very basic standpoint, that's kind of like your canary in the mine shaft to figure out what's going on with your site and whether or not it is client-side or server-side rendered. So that's kind of what we're saying here. Like basic elements that you can see on the page, is it actually reflective in the HTML that user agents would particularly be able to crawl and see? So that's one part. If they say that it's like, oh yeah, well, we're using a pre-render solution, pre-render solutions can be really, really awesome. But you're probably not going to be able to see it. So you might have to like maybe reverse engineer it through Cloudflare workers. But that's a whole other aspect, and I'm just very mindful of the time.
Wow, a lot of information there. What about if an SEO is in the fortunate position of being able to be involved prior to the site redesign, and the site's going to be designed in JavaScript? Are there a few great resources online that the SEO can point the developer to make sure that everything's done the right way?
I think with anything, I mean, it's all about relationships, right? Like if you become friends with these people and you're basically wanting to, work with them in a project management standpoint, a lot of the time, you have to kind of consider that they have a very set idea of like how they want to build a site. And you're kind of here to kind of like help guide them down the pathways so that, if we're thinking about like a bowling alley analogy, you want to be able to help guide them through that bowling ball to be able to hit the pins and not go into the tunnels on the either side. I don't know why I use that as an analogy, but there it is. So I think what's really important is have a set list of questions. And this is actually something that I've made like a template structure for my entire team, like with site migrations, because we need to be able to have like some really specific things. When it comes to this, yes, understanding the business workflow, but, ask about, are you changing the CMS? Do you have plans to change any of the URLs on these pages? Are you keeping the same titles and meta descriptions? Do you have any plans to get rid of pages or content like as part of the migration? And the thing that we really kind of need to start asking is, is there any kind of technical considerations we need to note in the lead up to this migration? Be aware of who you're asking. It might be the owner and they're like, I don't know, like I just said, to do this. And they might not even know that. You kind of need to really prod that. So as far as that is concerned, like just asking those kinds of like exploratory questions, asking about the technology stack of how they're going to be doing it. Is it going to be a custom site? Are they going to be using any, is it going to be written in Angular? Is it going to be written in React? Is it going to be Next.js potentially? Like those kinds of questions are really, really important to start like asking some exploratory things, and then just making them aware that like, okay, if we are going down this pathway, we really need to be aware of how it renders. Because like I said at the start of this whole thing, a lot of the time they've got a directive and the rendering part of the conversation is just completely just not even thought about. So you're just now helping to introduce that as a part of the planning process to be able to make sure that people are mindful. And as we're going through, we just keep testing and keep touching and reiterating on those parts. And there's so many different ways to server-side render, JavaScript. So again, it's really important that you ask these questions, and then you can sort of like change the methodology of how you actually deliver those recommendations. And they'll just really appreciate that you're just very mindful that, they've got a workflow. We've got a directive and a prerogative with this project, because the aim of the whole goal of this is to have a successful site. And we can all kind of like agree on that, core thing.
So what percentage of websites nowadays are using JavaScript like this? And is it significantly increasing? Is this something that all SEOs absolutely have to be aware of in the future?
I don't know the exact percentage because I'm just not privy to that kind of stuff. And to be honest, I'm sure you can Google maybe some kind of thing, but I would imagine that it'd be exponential. A lot of this stuff is super new. It's new for a lot of SEOs. It's new even for Google. And Martin Splitt, who has been a wonderful resource, to the SEO community, is really doing a really great job. For the last like 5 years, really helping people to be able to understand these new changes and things like that as it's been rolling out. So it is changing, and I think that it is very much, from what I can understand from listening to Google and having conversations with people on Twitter, it is their aim to be able to help their user agents and their tools and their processes and their browsers to be able to help understand all forms of different types of languages. But at the same time, like everything, it is a constantly evolving process. It's like using another language and making sure that it is compatible across systems rather than just understanding. So it is a slow burning process, and it is going to be something that we're hoping going to move towards. But I think just being aware of that is really, really super important.
And is this something that only needs to be of concern to SEOs after there's been a new site design or before a new site design? Or should JavaScript rendering be something that be done on a regular basis?
No, it's kind of like as soon as it's done, it's good. But if you are using third-party tools, it's always really important to see like what are the resources loaded into that. Because if you think about it, you'll see like, okay, like how many resources does it take to load that page? And there might be like, say, a third-party plugin that sort of just doesn't render at all. So it can kind of be a little bit detrimental. Or say, for example, they might insert an iframe and then nothing after that iframe will actually render properly. It's always really important to be aware of what you're looking at, and just be aware that, when it comes to this stuff, like it really does obey, HTML5 like protocol. So anything that sort of goes, outside of that, there are things you can do. You can be able to provide caching that's like, hey, Google, here's like a little snapshot and be able to save in your crawl budget here. Or there's like, if there's any like render blocking resources, you can use like, you can be able to defer it with something asynchronous, which is really great. And there's tons of opportunities, and Google's page speed insights is a really great way of being able to, again, be the canary in the mine shaft with that stuff, and Lighthouse as well.
Wow. Okay. So if an SEO is thinking, Nik, you've just blown my mind. I don't know what you're talking about. I really need to find out a lot more about JavaScript rendering.
My whole team.
but they don't have much time on their hands. So what's something that they might be doing that isn't much value at the moment that they should probably stop doing in order to spend more time finding out about JavaScript rendering?
Honestly, there are so many amazing, great tools. And Google also gives you a whole suite of different tools to be able to show, to be able to like test how pages are being perceived by their user agents. So Search Console, Search Console is great. If you don't have it, like the mobile friendly test is also really, really great. You can be able to see the rendered HTML. You can be able to see the screenshot and be able to what it can be able to see. PageSpeed Insights is really, really awesome as well. Lighthouse is really, really awesome as well. Search Console, that is your one-to-one way of like, we've been able to see this, but we have discovered it, but we have not indexed it. And here is why. We can be able to see the referring pages of how they were able to find those pages. And really, if you're not using Search Console on the regular, that is a bit of a red flag. Just because like why wouldn't you? Google has made this awesome free resource for any site owner to be able to help like unpack and like reverse engineer like how these things are happening and why it's happening as well. So if it's there, use it.
You can find Nik Ranger over at studiohawk.com.au. Nik, thanks for being part of SEO in 2022.
David, it's absolute honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Check out the rest of the content from SEO in 2022 over at SEOin2022.com.